Are you using the right forecasting method? And did you even know that there are different methods depending on the outcome or why you're forecasting? Well, you are in luck because that is what we're covering today. Welcome, and welcome to WFM Tipsy Thursdays. I am your show host, the Contact Center Whisperer, the CEO and founder of Solid Rock Consulting. And this episode is brought to you by Verint, the leader in workforce engagement and CX automation. Listen, I am super excited about this week's episode because we are continuing the conversation on forecasting. And for the month of February, you already know that we are using WFM Go Beyond, right, to guide our conversations all year. But specifically for February, we're talking about forecasting. So if you haven't grabbed the book yet, go over to WFMGoBeyond.com, grab your copy, okay? So we're going to be diving into the Verint platform this week. So I'm super geeked about that. But before we do, let's hop into the conversation on what we're talking about today, which is time series forecasting and point forecasting. When do I use which one? So listen, when you're making workforce decisions, choosing the right forecasting method is going to be key. And in contact centers, you're mainly going to be touching two types. You're going to be touching either time series or point forecasting. And again, there are plenty other ones, but that's what we're talking about for today's episode, time series and point forecasting. And they really both serve different purposes to ensure that you have the right budget in place, the right people in place at the right time, okay? So let's talk about time series really quickly, okay? Time series is going to be used for your long-term trends, patterns, when you have that information. And they're usually used to create budgets, all right? We want to use time series forecasting when our CFO or our finance team comes to us and say, hey, your annual budget is due. How many people do I need? When do I need to have these people? Also, when HR comes to you and say, hey, when does this hiring class need to be conducted? This is when we're using time series. So that's going to be super important because time series is going to be key because it's catching trends, it's catching patterns. Usually, you're going to use a time series method for long-term capacity planning, 6 to 12 months out, when you have trends that you need to identify, like seasonality, growth trends or decline trends. You have very slow periods, or again, you're doing budgeting or hiring projections. That's why we're going to use long-term capacity planning or long-term forecast for, again, which is typically the method that you're going to use is time series forecasting. So if every December I know that my volume increases by 30% because I'm in a retail-based business and shopping is through the roof and I'm getting a lot of interactions coming in, this is why I want to use my time series forecasting method for that. So it's super important that you understand that. Now, with point forecasting is going to be looking at a very specific point in time or a very specific event. Point forecasting is best used when, again, you're looking at a very specific point in time. This is most commonly used for short range planning. Usually you're 4 to 6 weeks out. Again, when you're trying to predict schedules. So whereas time series forecasting is usually trying to predict budgets, doing capacity planning, you're reaching out to HR. So you can say, hey, hire these 10 people, start hiring in September, so that December, we know that we're going to increase 30%. Let's make sure we're ahead of the curve. That's time series forecasting. Whereas, again, point forecasting is looking at a very specific point in time or a very specific event. We know Christmas happens every year, or we know we run this very specific campaign every year and our volume does not fluctuate. I'm trying to give you a lot of different examples, okay? So with time series forecasting, I'm looking for trends. My volume is fluctuating. I need to catch patterns. I need to look at seasonality. I may need to look at distribution from the month to month to month. That's time series forecasting. When your volume is shifting, you have a lot of seasonality or movement in your volume. Point forecasting, you typically aren't considering patterns or not as heavily anyway, because you're looking at a very specific point. Okay, so if I'm looking at a very specific point in time or a very specific event, that is the pattern. That is the point on which I'm basing my forecast off of. So that is time series forecasting. And then we have point forecasting. I want you to make sure that you understand the differences between the two, because as we hop into the Verint platform, I'm going to be showing you exactly kind of where you can apply each one of these methods and how it's applicable to your tool. Even if you don't have a tool, if you're using spreadsheets, how that's applicable. In today's fast-paced world, accurate forecasting isn't just a nice to have, it is a necessity. And that's where Verint comes in. With Verint's AI-powered workforce management tools, you can optimize staffing, reduce costs, and deliver exceptional customer experiences. Whether you're planning for seasonal peaks or adjusting schedules in real time, their advanced forecasting and automation capabilities take the guesswork out of workforce planning. So you can always make sure that you have the right people in the right place at the right time. Listen, if you're ready to take your workforce management to the next level, visit Verint.com to learn more. Now, back to the episode. Okay, so we've covered point forecasting. We've covered time series forecasting. We are in page 30 in the book of WFM Go Beyond. So if you haven't gotten your copy of the book, go to WFMGoBeyond.com. Follow along with us all year long. Next month, we're going to be pushing into scheduling. Again, we have the rest of this month to talk about forecasting in February. When to use which one and why you use which one. Again, it's not saying that you can't use time series forecasting for short range planning, or that you can't use point forecasting for long range planning or for budgeting purposes. However, this is when it's most applicable to use this method for a specific outcome. Again, time series is typically used for budgeting capacity when we have variation in our volume and we want to be able to catch trends and seasonality. We want to make hiring predictions. We're trying to meet budget, those different types of things. Whereas point forecasting is usually used for a very specific point in time or a very specific event, and or short range forecasting, creating schedules, daily planning, those types of things. Okay. So I'm super excited because we get to hop into the Verint platform. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go over to the Verint platform now so we can take a look at when we apply time series versus point forecasting. So I'm going to give you an example of this. This is the updated UI platform. So if you in here, if you're a Verint user, then you're going to be going into forecasting and scheduling. We're going to navigate over to forecasting and tactical forecast. Now, again, this isn't a training, so I haven't explained setting up campaigns and all of those different things that you definitely need to make sure that you are doing. So this is something, all right, that you need to do. But my point is I want to show you time series and what that would look like versus if I were in the point forecasting methodology or using that part of my brain. If I'm thinking about time series in the tactical forecasting, I can come in here and go to dates and say I'm forecasting for the week of February 9th. I can come in here and again, this isn't a training. I'm just wanting to show you something really quickly. So if I come in here to week, I can come in here and load my historical week right here at the bottom. And I'm going to say, okay, I want to look at the last 3 weeks. I'm going to just pick January because that's what I have data in here for. I'm going to add, and I'm going to say, this is going to tell me, okay, this is how your volume trended in for that week. So you can see I'm looking at a pattern. I'm looking at a trend. I can already immediately catch a pattern here. Typically, you would want to add 2 or 3 weeks so that you can actually catch a pattern. So just assume that I had 3 weeks right here and this was the pattern. What's the pattern that I'm catching? I'm catching that, oh, my Mondays are extremely high, and as the week goes on, my volume tapers off. Okay, that's the pattern that I'm catching. My AHT, which is down here, my average handle time, tends to be about the same every day. So that's an immediate pattern that I can catch. Okay, so if I'm looking at this and say this was for the year, right? I'm looking at this for a week, but say this was January, February, March, April, May, right? I would be able to say, oh, February is super high. Then March starts taper down. April starts to taper down. By, mid-year, by Q2, I'm really down. So now I can tell from a budgeting perspective, okay, I may need to have a lot of people in Q1, but by the time I get to Q2 and Q3, I start to taper down. Let natural attrition take its place. I don't need to necessarily put any higher classes in, but if I'm in Q4 and I'm looking at the first 2 or 3 months of the year, right? I've already know, hey, January, February, March, say these were months. Okay. Again, I know I'm looking at a week, but say this was a month, right? I can say, oh, these months are going to be extremely high. Make sure HR, right? You put in a hiring class for September so that by January, I am right size staffed. And when I'm in January, right? If I'm looking at this for March, these latter 2 months here, March and April, or let's call it April and May, since we're looking at 5 months here. That's what I'm saying. These are months, right? Then I would be able to say, oh, we taper down. Our volume tapers off drastically. Less natural attrition take its place, or this might be a great time to move people into other roles inside of the organization to eat up some of that occupancy and different things like that. So this is when time series forecasting would be really applicable in this particular scenario here. Now, on the other hand, say, for example, I wanted to do point forecasting. Okay. So my marketing team comes to me and say, hey, we're going to run this campaign and we're only going to open up the queue for 500 callers to come in because we're running this blitz or this sale. Great. I'm going to go ahead and the volume is going to come in very evenly, so forth and so on. So I'm going to come in here, right? And I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to get 500 calls every single day. Okay, based on my this particular campaign, and then I can come in here and type this in. Okay, so I'm going to go in here and say 360 for my average handle time. This is in seconds. Okay, 500 calls, 360, 500 calls. Every day I'm going to get this because this is what the campaign is, the marketing campaign is going to cut off at. Okay. Or I know for whatever the very specific point in time you're looking at, or again, whatever specific event. This is why we typically use point forecasting. Okay. So I know at this very specific point in time that this is what's going to happen. I'm going to add my shrinkage in if I need to add shrinkage in, and all the different variables for that particular point. Okay, so now for the week of the 16th, I have a point forecast versus the week of, if I go over here, back over to the 9th. So now I'm going to come over here to my goals and requirements. And now I can say, oh, okay, for the week of the 9th, where I did time series forecasting to look at trends, I was looking at the volume and the trends and the patterns and all of those different things. I can come in here and now say, oh, this is what my requirement is. And I can kind of hit this arrow right here and go to requirements. You can see I already have requirements in for 80/30 there. Okay, I can go ahead and say, okay, this is what my requirement is for February, right? So you can see I now have a requirement here. So for February 10th, based on the trends of the prior weeks, prior months, and how my volume came in, I can say, oh, this is what my requirement is. Okay, so this is in hours right here. So if I come here, I can see, oh, okay, I need, for this volume, I need 174 people at the 9:45 interval. Whereas if I use point forecasting, okay, I'm going to go over to this other week here where I was looking at a very specific point in time. Okay, I'm going to look at Monday for this week. My goals and requirements are still the same, 80/30, but my volume is drastically different because I'm looking at a very specific point in time for a very specific campaign. You can see at the 9:45 interval here, I only need the 5 people. Okay. Again, volume is drastically different than what I was looking at with the time series based on all of that historical data versus here I'm manually looking at, or I'm very specifically looking at a very specific event and saying, okay, how many people do I need? When do I need them? What kind of schedules do I need? And this is the difference between time series and point forecasting and how you can leverage your tool. So this is going to be the difference between time series forecasting and point forecasting and the method and why you would be using one versus the other. What I particularly love about Verint is they have strategic planner, which is actually, so you saw me in the platform talking about pulling in the historical weeks and looking at the trends there. You can actually also in strategic planner use that more so for capacity planning and budgeting and mapping in when your hiring classes need to be based on when people graduate out of the class, based on how long it takes the class to be. And so it'll tell you exactly when you need to plot your actual classes. So that's what I love about strategic planner, which I didn't necessarily show in this particular episode because we're not talking about strategic planner. We're talking about time series and point forecasting. So you got to tune in for another episode if you want to see that. But again, time series, point forecasting are super important that you understand those concepts and you understand when to use which one, because as a workforce leader, your operations team isn't going to come to you and say, hey, give me a time series forecast, okay? They're not going to come to you and say that. They're going to come to you and say, hey, I need to prepare the budget for the year. They're going to say, hey, I need to understand when I need to hire people. And so it's going to be your job to really understand, okay, this is what I need. This is the method I need to use in order to give my leadership what they're looking for. Or you're going to have operations coming to you or HR coming to you and saying, hey, what type of shifts do we need to hire for? You might want to be using your short range planning for that. In the book, WFM Go Beyond, we talk about demand forecasts. We talk about capacity planning. And so you want to make sure that you grab the book at WFM Go Beyond so that you can understand the differences, so that when your operations and your leadership team is asking you for very specific things, you can take that time to educate them on what the ask is, because sometimes they're just saying, hey, I need a budget. And in order to give them that, you know that you need, okay, I need 6 to 12 months worth of data so I can catch the trends. Because if I'm creating a budget for the year or for 6 months off of a week of data, then if in the example that I showed you where January was much higher than February and February was much higher than March, right? And I'm creating a budget off just January, then when I get to March, I'm going to be extremely overstaffed and I'm not going to understand what's happening and why that's happening. I'm going to be extremely over budget. So that is the big impact of time series forecasting. And you really want to understand that. Whereas with point forecasting, you're looking at a very specific point in time or a very specific event. So if you need help with that and you want to dive deeper into that conversation, just leave me a comment and let me know. I may do an actual forecasting class on that for you guys. Okay. Did you enjoy this week's episode? Was it informative? Was it transformative? Did it help you gain deeper insights? Well, leave me a comment and let me know if so, or if not, what additional questions you have. And make sure that you go and grab the book at wfmgobeyond.com. Listen, all year we are talking about workforce management and the impacts. Again, section 1 of the book is the tactical, so the foundation parts of workforce management. So again, this month we're talking about forecast because it's pillar 2. And so make sure you grab your copy there. But as we push later into the year, we're going to be shifting our tone to, okay, we've covered the foundation of workforce management, and now we want to push into how it's connected to customer experience and employee experience, business profitability, and ensuring that you as a workforce management leader or operations leader that's trying to relate to workforce management a little deeper have the understanding of how these are intricately connected, okay? So in today's episode where we talked about time series forecasting method and the point forecasting method, this is critical as we move into CX, EX, and business profitability. Because if we're not understanding which method to use and which method to apply, how do we get a seat at the table when we're talking to our finance team and our leadership team and helping them to understand why the budget is off or why we are constantly not hiring and we always seem like we're understaffed? Well, this is because you're not using the right method in order to make sure you catch the trends. Right? Again, in the example that I use, if I'm using just the 1 week of data to produce a budget for entire year, that would be problematic, okay? I hope this week's episode of WFM Tipsy Thursdays was helpful to you. Leave us a comment and let us know. You already know what to do. Until next time, go be great and let's make impact. See you guys soon.